The Black Widow of Lincoln Square. Inspector Purbright. BBC radio drama. It was an ordinary Thursday in the small town of Flaxborough. The sun had slipped behind a grey cloud for the time being, casting a soft, melancholy light over the stone-paved streets. The market square bustled with its usual activity: stalls selling fresh produce, the clink of coins changing hands, and the chatter of locals catching up on the gossip of the week. The usual backdrop of tranquility, a town wrapped in its own unhurried rhythm. The flower show, an annual highlight for the few gardeners left in the town, was in full swing. Mrs. Bowers, as usual, had managed to arrange her prize-winning chrysanthemums in precisely the same formation as last year. No one could quite understand how she did it, nor could they deny the mild envy it stirred in the hearts of her neighbours. But it was not Mrs. Bowers' chrysanthemums that would become the talk of the town, nor was it the heated discussion about the new railway timetable, an issue that had occupied much of the local council's attention in recent weeks. No, it was an entirely different matter that would be whispered over teacups and pint glasses in the coming days. It all started with a faint cry, a single, unexpected cry. Not the kind of cry that anyone could recall distinctly, but one that punctuated the air for just long enough to make a few heads turn. It came from the direction of the Black Widow, the old house at the end of Lincoln Square. It had been empty for years, much to the relief of the locals, who still harboured memories of the last occupant, Mrs. Marigold Driscoll, a reclusive widow who had spent her days peering through her curtains with a look that could turn a man to stone. The house had stood abandoned, but still looming, its windows dark and uninviting, casting a shadow on the square. Until today. The cry was followed by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut. Then nothing. The market continued its usual hum, but now there was a lingering uncertainty in the air, as though something had just nudged the town's natural order. Mrs. Wren, a sharp-eyed widow herself, was the first to notice it. "The Black Widow's back," she whispered, to anyone who would listen. No one had seen her for weeks. No one, that is, except for the local grocer, who mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd seen her at the window just the day before. Her face, hidden in shadow, had been watching. Watching who or what remained a mystery. It was just after lunchtime when the local constable, Robert Hodge, received a phone call from the town clerk. A body had been discovered in the garden of the Black Widow's house. The voice on the other end was rushed and flustered. "There's blood, Hodge." The body's lying there in full view. "Right under the old elm tree," came the voice, strained with both concern and disbelief. "What should we do?" Hodge, normally a calm man, didn't immediately respond. A long, uncomfortable pause followed, and then he gave his usual reply, "I'll have a look." As he approached the scene, a small crowd had already gathered, eyes wide with suspicion, and tongues wagging in every direction. The body, however, was not immediately identified. It was a man, mid-30s by the look of it, but there were no immediate signs of recognition. His clothes were rich, but now stained with the marks of his violent end. For all its quiet exterior, Flaxborough had a habit of holding secrets, and this body was just the beginning. At the centre of it all, of course, was Mrs. Driscoll. Was she involved? No one could say, but the few who knew her well were quick to point out the peculiarities that had surrounded her in the years before her disappearance. Inspector Purbright was on the case before the afternoon was out. The other officers, of course, had their own theories, ranging from a botched robbery to some sordid affair gone wrong. But Purbright, as always, took his time, choosing to observe the unfolding scene with the practised eye of a man who knew that answers would come only after all the unspoken things had been said. He arrived at the scene and surveyed the body without a word. No, the details didn't speak to him yet. There was something more to this. "Any witnesses?" Purbright asked, his voice clipped but not unfriendly. Constable Hodge shuffled his feet, looking around nervously. "A few people heard the cry," he said, glancing at the small crowd. "They say it came from the Black Widow's house. But no one knows exactly what it was." Purbright's gaze lingered for a moment on the crowd, their eyes wide with curiosity, but also with the unmistakable thrill of local gossip. "Keep them back," Purbright said quietly as he moved closer to the body. He leaned over, inspecting the position of the man's body. The blood had pooled around his head, staining the grass dark and heavy. No weapon was visible, but something in the way the body lay caught Purbright's attention. The arms, the angle of the legs, there was no fight, no struggle, just an ending. "An odd place for a murder," Purbright muttered. "Well, it's an odd town," Hodge replied, his voice laced with tension. "And you know the Black Widow?" Purbright raised a finger to silence him. "Yes, I know the Black Widow. And I don't believe she's as innocent as some might think." As Purbright quietly surveyed the scene, it was clear that the whispers had begun. The town of Flaxborough had seen enough crime to know that this wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. But who was behind it? Was the Black Widow finally involved, or was this yet another in a long line of unexplained mysteries? The game, it seemed, had only just begun. Purbright's eyes swept over the gathered crowd, sensing their barely contained excitement. Gossip was already simmering, each of the townsfolk with their own theory, some dark, others absurd, and all of them sprinkled with a generous dose of speculation. He could hear snippets of conversation as he moved through the onlookers, voices low but insistent, carrying undercurrents of fear and curiosity. "There's no way she'd do something like this," a middle-aged man was muttering to his wife. "She's been shut up in that house for years." "Not so sure," came a soft voice from behind. "It's always the quiet ones, isn't it?" Purbright paused at the edge of the crowd, allowing his gaze to settle on Mrs. Wren, who had been an outspoken critic of Mrs. Driscoll ever since her husband's death many years ago. The widow had a particular way of looking at people, a way of making them feel small without a single word. Purbright wasn't one for making assumptions, but Mrs. Wren's air of mild disdain spoke volumes about the complicated undercurrents that ran beneath the town's unruffled exterior. "Keep your distance," Purbright said gently to a young constable who had moved to push closer to the body. The constable hesitated, then nodded and backed away, though his eyes never left the scene. Purbright crouched down next to the body, his expression inscrutable. The man's clothes were expensive, tailored to fit perfectly, but there was something off about the neatness of his appearance. It was as if he had been dressed for a meeting, a formal gathering, his tie immaculate, his shoes polished to a high shine. This wasn't the sort of attire one would expect for a casual walk in the square, and certainly not for someone caught in the throes of a violent end. There was no obvious sign of a struggle. His hands lay flat against the earth, not clenched in defiance, nor outstretched in a desperate attempt to break a fall. It was as if he had simply lain down to rest, but the deep red stains soaking into the ground told a different story entirely. This was murder, of that Purbright had no doubt. The inspector's attention shifted to the area around the body, his mind clicking through possibilities with the calm precision that had become his trademark. No discarded weapon, no sign of forced entry into the garden, nothing that could immediately shed light on the events leading up to the man's death. Purbright's lips pressed together in thought as he stood, dusting off his trousers with the smooth motion of someone accustomed to walking carefully through a world full of secrets. He turned toward the house, its dark windows staring back at him like a watchful eye. A gust of wind caught the corners of the overgrown ivy climbing the walls, rustling the leaves. The Black Widow had once been a home to many rumours, and it seemed it was about to become the subject of far more than idle talk. "Who was he?" Purbright asked, his voice soft but commanding as he looked at Constable Hodge. I don't know, sir," Hodge admitted, a touch of unease in his voice. "No one seems to recognize him." He wasn't a local. Purbright's eyes narrowed as he shifted his gaze from the body back to the house. "Then it's time to find out who he is, and why he chose to come to Lincoln Square today." The crowd continued to murmur, but Purbright ignored them, focusing only on the task at hand. He turned to Hodge and spoke again, his tone clipped. "Secure the area. No one leaves without speaking to me. Start with Mrs. Wren. She's been watching this house for years." Hodge nodded, his expression reflecting both the weight of responsibility and a sense of confusion. He had seen his share of strange occurrences in Flaxborough, but nothing had prepared him for the undercurrents of tension that seemed to hang around the Black Widow's house now. Purbright, however, appeared unflappable as always, his mind working in quiet overdrive. As the constable moved to do as instructed, Purbright stepped back and took another long look at the body. There were no immediate signs of a break-in. The man didn't appear to have been robbed, and there were no marks on him to suggest he had been attacked before being killed. Yet something about the overall situation didn't sit right. The absence of a struggle, the man's pristine appearance, it was as if someone had lured him to this very spot, calm and unsuspecting, and then simply ended his life without a second thought. Purbright's mind began to churn with possibilities, but he kept them to himself. He had learned long ago that conclusions could often lead one astray, especially in a town as accustomed to secrecy as Flaxborough. For now, it was better to follow the facts, no matter how insignificant they seemed. He glanced once more at the house, its peeling shutters and sagging porch, giving it the look of something abandoned long ago. And yet it was still very much at the heart of the mystery. Someone had died in its shadow, and Purbright was determined to uncover why. The inspector glanced over his shoulder, watching, as Constable Hodge spoke with a group of bystanders, most of whom were still trying to piece together their own version of events. Mrs. Wren was among them, no doubt offering her own interpretation of the cry that had been heard earlier. But Purbright's attention was elsewhere. The town's quiet reputation was at stake. No longer could it be viewed as a sleepy market town where nothing ever happened. Something had changed. And if there was one thing Purbright knew, it was that every change, no matter how subtle, could be traced back to a single moment. A moment when someone, somewhere, had decided to act. This murder was no accident, and Purbright would see that the truth came to light. He stepped away from the scene, his mind already formulating the next steps. The investigation had only just begun, but it was already clear that no stone would be left unturned in this quiet corner of England. Purbright stood for a moment, surveying the scene with quiet attention to detail. The square was slowly starting to regain its usual rhythm, the hum of conversation creeping back as the onlookers whispered amongst themselves. The murder had not just disrupted the town's peace, it had infected it with an air of suspicion that would linger whether anyone cared to admit it or not. Purbright's fingers rested briefly on the brim of his hat as he made his way toward the house, his boots clicking lightly on the cobblestone as he moved one step at a time through the space where chaos had just entered the town's calm routine. Mrs. Wren had already begun to chatter to Constable Hodge, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who felt they knew more than they actually did. The inspector paused to listen, catching fragments of the conversation. "Always been a strange one, that Mrs. Driscoll," Mrs. Wren was saying. "Never trust a widow who stays to herself, never mixes with anyone. No family, no friends, just her, and that house." Purbright looked over at Mrs. Wren but said nothing. He had long learned that the more people talked, the more they revealed, and Mrs. Wren had already made it clear she had plenty of opinions, even if they were largely based on her own long-standing grievances with the reclusive widow. "Do you think it's her?" the constable asked, though his voice lacked conviction. He was clearly unsure of how to proceed. In a town like Flaxborough, where things had always been predictable and quiet, a murder was something no one had been prepared for. Purbright smiled slightly, the hint of amusement in his eyes. "That's a question I'm going to answer very carefully, Constable." "But not yet." He motioned toward the house again. It was still quiet, the overgrown ivy curling like hands that sought to hide the building's secrets. No sign of life from within, though Purbright knew that was not always a guarantee. The widow was certainly capable of keeping herself out of sight when she wished. It was the house, not her, that had always been the subject of whispered stories. The place was an enigma, and now it seemed that the past had finally caught up with it. The inspector turned back to the body, his gaze returning to the still form of the man lying beneath the old elm tree. It didn't take a seasoned detective to see that this wasn't a crime of passion. There was no frenzy here, no rush. Whoever had done this had done it with care, in the quietest of ways. Purbright crouched beside the body again, carefully inspecting the clothes and the positioning of the body, trying to piece together the small clues left behind. The man had no identification, nothing to indicate his purpose in Flaxborough. He hadn't fought, and his eyes, though dull and lifeless now, didn't bear the marks of someone who had been blindsided. This man had known he was going to die. His final moments hadn't been a surprise. They had been calculated. Purbright stood again and looked around. First few to be questioned would be the ones who had lived in the shadow of the Black Widow house. His mind returned to the whisperings of Mrs. Wren, and he made a mental note to speak with her later. Her insights would be more useful than she realized. As Purbright made his way back to the constable, he saw a familiar face pushing through the crowd. It was Sergeant Thorne, a local man who had been with the Flaxborough police for years. His face was etched with the sort of fatigue that came from years of seeing too many familiar faces, each one with their own story and their own secrets to keep. "Inspector?" Thorne greeted him with a nod, his gaze flicking toward the body before settling on Purbright. "What's your take on it?" Purbright smiled thinly, though his eyes remained sharp and calculating. "Not enough, Thorne. Not enough to make any conclusions just yet. But we'll find out. We always do." The sergeant, clearly unwilling to press further, gave a nod of agreement and turned to assist with the growing crowd. Purbright watched him for a moment, then turned back to Hodge, who was still trying to herd the townsfolk away from the crime scene. "We'll need to find out who he is, Constable." "No one is going anywhere until we know that. I want a complete list of anyone who has recently come into town, anyone who's stayed overnight, or visited the square in the past week." Hodge looked slightly flustered, but he nodded obediently. "Right away, sir." Purbright took a deep breath, allowing the quiet to settle around him. He didn't rush, it wasn't in his nature. His mind worked, carefully running through the possibilities, each one leading to more questions, not answers. He glanced once again at the body, at the dark stains seeping into the grass, and a thought settled in the back of his mind. He'd seen this kind of thing before. Too many quiet deaths, deaths that no one seemed to question until the day they couldn't be ignored anymore. It was always about the details, the things people didn't say. Flaxborough was no different. Purbright started moving again, his thoughts moving quicker now as he approached the Black Widow's house. The door stood ajar slightly, as if inviting him inside. His steps were deliberate as he crossed the threshold, careful not to disturb anything that might be useful. The air was thick with dust, the smell of disuse hanging heavy in the room. Everything was in place, the furniture neatly arranged, as if waiting for someone to sit down. But Purbright's eyes went immediately to the small table in the corner. There, beside a stack of papers, lay a single, neatly folded letter. It had no address, no name, just a simple wax seal. Purbright picked it up gently, turning it over in his hands. His fingers traced the seal before he slowly broke it open, revealing the contents inside. It was short, but no less telling. "I'll see you tonight. Be ready." The words were simple enough, but the implications were immediate. A meeting, a plan. The man who had died in the garden had been expected. But who had sent the letter? And more importantly, who had been waiting? Purbright's brow furrowed as he folded the letter carefully. This was no random death. This had been set into motion long before that final cry had echoed through the town square. A faint sound broke through his thoughts, footsteps behind him. He turned, finding Constable Hodge standing just inside the door, his face pale. "Sir," Hodge said quietly, "there's someone here to see you." Purbright's lips curled slightly, a hint of amusement in his otherwise composed demeanour. "Bring them in, Constable. We're just getting started." And so, as the investigation began to take shape, the inspector felt the first real stirrings of clarity in a case that had already begun to take on its own dark momentum. The widow, the letter, the stranger, it was all starting to intertwine. But Purbright knew, as always, that the most dangerous moments in his investigations were those quiet ones just before everything clicked into place. Purbright paused for a moment, carefully placing the letter in his coat pocket before turning to face Constable Hodge, whose expression was a mix of nervousness and curiosity. Hodge was young, eager to prove himself, but it was clear that the gravity of the situation had taken him by surprise. The body, the letter, the quiet murmurings of the townsfolk. Flaxborough had never seen anything like it. "Who's here to see me?" Purbright asked quietly, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that suggested he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. He didn't have to look up to know that the town was beginning to stir. Everyone would want to know what the inspector was going to do next. The same crowd that had been present just moments before now felt like a distant hum in the back of his mind, as if they were nothing more than background noise to the unfolding mystery. Hodge shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncertain, but then nodded toward the door. It's Mrs. Driscoll's solicitor, sir." Mr. Franklin Purbright's eyes narrowed at the mention of the solicitor's name. Franklin wasn't a man who typically made house calls, especially not under these circumstances. But Purbright said nothing, merely giving a single, acknowledging nod. There was no time to waste now. This was the moment when all the threads that had started to unravel would either be tied together or snapped apart. The constable opened the door and stepped aside, allowing a thin man in his late 50s to enter. Mr. Franklin was impeccably dressed, his suit crisp and his tie knotted just so, but it was the sharp look in his eyes that caught Purbright's attention. He was a man who had seen plenty, and who had no intention of showing any weakness in front of the inspector. "Inspector Purbright, I presume?" Franklin's voice was smooth, cultured with the kind of calm authority that one would expect from a solicitor. He did not offer his hand, nor did Purbright extend his. There was no need for pleasantries in this line of work. The air between them felt taut, as though Franklin had already made up his mind about what he was doing here, and Purbright was simply a tool in his plan. "I am," Purbright replied evenly, his gaze not leaving Franklin's. "What brings you to Flaxborough, Mr. Franklin?" Franklin's lips curled slightly in what could have been a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've come to offer my assistance. Mrs. Driscoll is—" He paused, as if carefully selecting his words. "In a delicate situation, I thought it best to speak with you directly." Purbright didn't respond immediately. Instead, studying Franklin's every move, there was something about the solicitor's composure that didn't sit right. Was he here to help? Or was he here to protect something? "She's in more than a delicate situation, Mr. Franklin," Purbright said after a moment, his tone firm but not unkind. "A man is dead, and your client's house is the scene of the crime. I believe that makes it far more than delicate." Franklin stiffened, his expression momentarily flickering before he regained control. "I am well aware of that, Inspector," he said, his voice lower now. "But you must understand, Mrs. Driscoll has had no involvement in this, nor would she ever." He seemed to be talking more to himself than to Purbright at this point, but the words were carefully chosen. It was clear he had prepared this defense in advance. "She has been a reclusive woman for many years, and, well, people have always misunderstood her." Purbright's eyes remained steady on the solicitor. "I think it's a little too early to make assumptions, don't you agree?" "I'm still piecing things together." "Of course," Franklin replied quickly, though his tone betrayed a hint of impatience. "But I believe it's important to clarify that Mrs. Driscoll has no criminal history, no reason to harm anyone. She's a woman of, well, a certain age, and her health has not been the best in recent months." Purbright considered the solicitor's words carefully, then nodded. "I'll need to speak to Mrs. Driscoll." Franklin's eyes widened imperceptibly, but the change in his demeanor was subtle enough to be missed by anyone who wasn't paying close attention. "I'm afraid that's not possible at the moment, Inspector. Mrs. Driscoll is not well. She has been under the weather for the past several days and is not in a fit state to be questioned." "I see," Purbright said, his voice still even, though there was a sharpness to it now. "And yet she managed to send you here to speak on her behalf." Mr. Franklin stiffened again, his face twitching with the slightest sign of discomfort. "She trusted me to handle this matter," he replied. "I'm simply here to ensure she is not unfairly implicated in something she has no knowledge of." Purbright took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Franklin's. "I'm not concerned with what Mrs. Driscoll knows, Mr. Franklin. I'm concerned with the facts, and the facts right now are that a man is dead in her garden. I suggest you speak to her and let me know when she's available to speak with me." For a brief moment Franklin hesitated, then with a heavy sigh he nodded, though it was clear he wasn't pleased with the turn of events. "Of course, Inspector. I will inform her of your wishes." He turned, his footsteps soft on the creaking floorboards as he made his way back to the door. "Mr. Franklin," Purbright called after him, his voice as calm as ever. "One more thing." Franklin stopped and turned, his face guarded. "Yes, Inspector?" "The letter. I found it in Mrs. Driscoll's home. You wouldn't happen to know anything about it, would you?" Franklin's face flickered with something, surprise perhaps, or the briefest flash of guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. "A letter? I don't know what you mean. Mrs. Driscoll has had no visitors, no correspondence, at least not in the way you might think." Purbright nodded slowly, his mind already racing through the implications. "I see. Well, I suggest you take a good look at it, Mr. Franklin. It may be important, With that, the solicitor left the room, his footsteps echoing faintly down the hall. Purbright stood in the silence that followed, feeling the weight of the mystery settle more firmly on his shoulders. Mrs. Driscoll was hiding something. He was certain of that now. And Franklin's protective attitude only made the situation more suspicious. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there was much left to discover. Purbright turned back to the window, his gaze once more falling on the Black Widow house. The game was afoot. And, as always, Purbright would wait, carefully, until every final thread came into view. Purbright watched as Mr. Franklin's figure disappeared down the narrow street, the solicitor's stiff posture betraying an unease that Purbright knew well. There was something calculated in Franklin's every movement, a practiced disinterest in the things that mattered most. For a moment, the inspector considered following him, but he knew better than to chase shadows. Franklin would lead him exactly where he wanted, not a step further. Instead, Purbright turned back to the small, cluttered room of the Black Widow's house. The atmosphere inside hadn't changed since he first entered, but now it felt heavier, laden with questions that remained unanswered. Mrs. Driscoll's house had always been a mystery, but now it was a crucial part of a larger puzzle. The man's death in the garden, the letter, Franklin's sudden appearance. It was all too neat, too tidy, like the carefully orchestrated movements of a game being played by someone who knew the rules better than the players. The inspector's eyes swept over the room once more. The faded curtains, the dusty furniture, and the odd collection of old papers scattered across the table, all these details seemed so ordinary, so commonplace, yet they were part of a larger design. He moved toward the small writing desk where the letter had been found. His fingers hovered over the papers, scanning the contents for anything out of place, anything that might lead him to a clearer understanding of what was happening behind the scenes. There was a small stack of letters, none of them recent, and a few tattered books on the shelves. But then his eyes caught something that made him pause. Tucked beneath a small pile of forgotten receipts was a map, a hand-drawn map, yellowed with age. It wasn't much, just a faint outline of Flaxborough and the surrounding countryside, but it was marked with two symbols. One was a circle drawn around the Black Widow house. The other was a small X near the edge of town, just beyond the market square. Purbright's pulse quickened. Maps like these were not used by ordinary people. They were used by those who needed to plan, to hide, to move unseen. The map wasn't meant to be found, and yet it had been left here, hidden in plain sight. He carefully slipped it into his coat pocket, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling in his mind. This was the first solid lead he had since the investigation began. As he stepped outside, the town seemed eerily still. The sounds of the market were distant now, the bustle of the crowd reduced to background noise. Flaxborough had always been quiet, but this silence felt different. It was the silence of a town that knew something was wrong but was too afraid to speak of it. People exchanged hurried glances as Purbright walked past, their whispers hanging in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. He didn't need to ask what they were talking about. He already knew. This murder, this mystery, had seeped into every corner of the town, and now it was consuming them all. Purbright made his way toward the square, his steps purposeful. He had learned long ago that a case like this didn't unfold through brute force or rapid conclusions. It required patience, the careful untangling of threads that at first glance seemed unrelated. He was beginning to see the outlines of a larger story, but the details remained hidden in the shadows. As he walked, his mind turned over what he had learned so far. The dead man in the garden, the cryptic letter, the map. There was a connection. He was sure of it. But to find that connection, he needed to dig deeper. He needed to ask the right questions, follow the right leads, and, most importantly, not make assumptions. He reached the square and found Constable Hodge standing near the entrance to the local tavern. Hodge straightened as he saw the inspector approach, his face a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. "Sir, I've got something," Hodge said, his voice low but urgent. "A witness." "One of the market vendors, he says he saw someone leaving the Black Widow house last night." Purbright's interest was piqued. "Who?" "A man, sir. Tall, dressed in dark clothes. The vendor couldn't see his face, but he said the man was carrying something. Couldn't say what. He seemed in a hurry, like he didn't want to be seen." The inspector nodded. "And this vendor? Where is he now?" "Just across the square, at his stall." Purbright motioned for Hodge to lead the way. As they approached the vendor's stall, the man looked up, his face weathered by years of working under the sun. He had a nervous energy about him, the kind that suggested he knew he had information, but wasn't sure whether he should share it. "Morning, sir," the vendor greeted, his voice hesitant. I don't know if this is important, but I saw someone leave the Black Widow house last night." Purbright's gaze sharpened. "Tell me everything you saw." The vendor shifted uncomfortably, casting a quick glance at the few passers-by who were within earshot. "It was late, after the market had closed. I was packing up when I saw him. A tall man, maybe 6 feet, dressed all in black. He came out of the back door of the house, looked around like he was checking if anyone saw him. Then he took off down the alley toward the edge of town. I didn't see his face, but the way he was walking, like he was in a hurry, well, it didn't sit right with me." Purbright's mind raced. The timeline was coming into focus. This wasn't some random crime of opportunity. Whoever had killed the man in the garden had been careful, precise, and knew exactly how to avoid being seen. They had been planning for this. "What time was this?" Purbright asked. The vendor thought for a moment before answering. "Just after 9, I'd say." No later, Purbright nodded, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The letter, the map, the man who had been seen leaving the house. There was more to this than just a murder. This was the beginning of something far deeper. "Thank you," Purbright said, his voice firm but appreciative. He turned to Hodge. "Make sure this vendor is available to speak again if we need him. And find out if anyone else saw anything unusual last night." Hodge nodded and went off to do as instructed. Purbright remained where he stood for a moment longer, letting the weight of the new information settle into his mind. It wasn't enough to solve the case, but it was enough to confirm what he had suspected. Someone in Flaxborough knew more than they were letting on. It was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Purbright looked back at the Black Widow house, its shadow falling across the square, and allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. He was getting closer. And when the truth finally came to the surface, he knew it would be just as unexpected as it was inevitable. Purbright's mind churned as he walked back through the square, the vendor's words echoing in his thoughts. The tall man, dressed in black, had emerged from the back door of the Black Widow house, moving quickly and purposefully. The timeline was taking shape, slowly, almost too slowly for his liking. But there was no rushing this, no skipping steps. Every detail had to be examined with care, no matter how small it seemed. The quiet hum of the square surrounded him again as he made his way back to the Black Widow house. This time, he didn't head directly to the front door. Instead, he moved around the side, taking note of the overgrown ivy climbing the walls, the cracked windows, the remnants of something that had once been carefully maintained, but now stood neglected. Purbright's eyes narrowed as he reached the back of the house. The alleyway the vendor had mentioned was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to pass through without brushing against the walls. The cobblestones here were slick with age and weather, and a faint scent of dampness lingered in the air. This wasn't the kind of place one would choose to make an entrance or an exit unless they had something to hide. He crouched down, inspecting the ground carefully. No obvious footprints, no sign of a struggle. But there was something about the area that felt off, as if the alley itself were holding its breath. He stood and made his way back to the front of the house, where Constable Hodge had returned, looking more flustered than before. "Sir, there's someone here to see you again," Hodge said, his tone cautious. "It's Mr. Franklin. He insists it's urgent." Purbright's eyebrow arched. The solicitor was persistent, but this sudden urgency only added more layers to the mystery. "Bring him in, Constable." Let's see what he wants now." Mr. Franklin entered with his usual composure, but there was an edge to him now, something tighter in his step, his shoulders a little more squared. His eyes darted around the room before settling on Purbright. There was no offer of pleasantries this time, just the hint of something more calculated in his gaze. "Inspector, I've come to clarify matters," Franklin said, his voice low and even. "Mrs. Driscoll has asked that I speak with you about something delicate." Purbright didn't reply immediately. He simply raised an eyebrow, inviting Franklin to continue. "I've been informed," Franklin continued, "that you are questioning her involvement in this tragic incident." "I must remind you, Inspector, that Mrs. Driscoll is an elderly woman in poor health. She has no involvement in any wrongdoing." "I never said she was involved, Mr. Franklin," Purbright said quietly. "I merely said I would need to speak to her. You've been quite vocal about defending her, but I haven't heard a single word from Mrs. Driscoll herself." Franklin stiffened, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. "She's not well enough to speak to you at the moment." "But I can assure you she has no connection to the death in her garden." "This is all a misunderstanding." Purbright took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Franklin's. "Then why the secrecy? Why this sudden insistence on defending her when you won't even allow her to speak for herself?" Franklin hesitated, his composure faltering just slightly. "I'm merely following her wishes. She doesn't want to be involved in this. She's afraid that—" "Afraid of what exactly?" Purbright's voice was sharp now, a quiet challenge in his words. Franklin paused, visibly flustered. "Afraid that her past will be dredged up. She has always been a private woman. She doesn't want people to know about her former life." The solicitor's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Purbright didn't move, letting the silence stretch just long enough for Franklin to realize the weight of his own admission. "So there is something in her past?" Purbright asked, the question hanging like a slow strike of thunder before the storm. Franklin's face paled and he quickly glanced away. "I said nothing of the sort, Inspector." Purbright smiled slightly, though there was no warmth in it. "You didn't have to, Mr. Franklin. It's in the way you said it, the way you're avoiding the issue. What is it you're so desperate to keep hidden?" Franklin's jaw clenched tightly, and for a moment the solicitor looked as though he might leave, but then his shoulders sagged as he seemed to weigh the situation. His words came slowly, reluctantly. "Mrs. Driscoll. She had a brother, an estranged brother. No one in town knows much about him, but he came to visit her some years ago. After that, he disappeared. He was never heard from again. The family, well, they don't talk about him." Purbright's interest peaked. A missing brother, a secret past. It was starting to make sense, more so than anything else so far. And you think this is just coincidence? That a man has been found dead in her garden, and it has nothing to do with the past you've just alluded to? Franklin's eyes flickered, and he seemed to search for the right words, but then he exhaled sharply. I don't know what happened, Inspector. I can't speak for what happened last night, but I can tell you this. If you dig too deep into Mrs. Driscoll's past, you may find more than you expect. And some things, they are best left forgotten. Purbright was quiet for a long moment, allowing the tension in the room to build. Franklin had just given him a key to unlock something he hadn't even known was there. A missing person, a connection to the past, and a family secret that no one wanted to speak of. Thank you, Mr. Warren. Franklin, Purbright said finally, his voice calm, though the wheels in his mind were already turning. I'll need to speak with Mrs. Driscoll soon, but for now, I suggest you make sure she's ready for the questions I'll be asking. The past, as you said, is something best left forgotten, but it has a habit of coming to light when it's least expected. Franklin said nothing in response, his face a mask of restrained frustration. He turned on his heel and left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. Purbright stood in the quiet that followed, his thoughts racing. He had a missing brother, an estranged family, and a woman with a secret past that was now more dangerous than ever. The town was beginning to reveal its true face, and Purbright knew that if he kept following the threads, he'd soon find the answers he was looking for. The murder wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Purbright stood alone for a few moments after Franklin's departure, letting the solicitor's words settle like dust in the room. A missing brother, an estranged family member who no one spoke of, and an unsettling past tied to Mrs. Driscoll, a woman who, up until now, had seemed nothing more than a shadow of the town's older generation. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take form, but the image was still blurry, shrouded in secrecy. If Mrs. Driscoll's brother was tied to this in any way, it was a key that Purbright would need to unlock carefully. His eyes flicked back to the letter he had placed in his coat pocket earlier, the one with the simple yet ominous message. I'll see you tonight. Be ready. Franklin had dismissed it without a second thought, but Purbright knew better. Letters like that didn't simply materialize out of thin air. Whoever had sent it knew more than they let on, and Purbright was determined to find out who that was. The inspector stepped over to the window, his fingers brushing the edge of the glass as he looked out onto the town. The Black Widow house loomed in the distance, its outline barely visible against the fading light of the late afternoon. It was almost as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter of its story to unfold. "Sir, you're needed at the station," came Hodges' voice from the doorway, breaking the silence. Purbright turned, his mind still circling the mystery at hand. "What is it, Constable?" "There's been a new development, sir. The vendor, the one who saw the man leave the house last night, he's had a second thought. He's remembered something else." Purbright didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." The constable led him briskly through the winding streets, and they reached the station in no time. Inside, the vendor stood nervously by a desk, wringing his hands as though he were caught between his fear of the unknown and his desire to be helpful. Purbright approached him quietly, studying the man's anxious expression. "Mr. Fletch," Purbright greeted him, his voice calm but firm. "What is it you remembered?" The vendor swallowed hard before speaking, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't mention it before, but I think I saw something. After the man left Mrs. Driscoll's house, I saw him go down the alley. But just before he disappeared into the shadows, he stopped. He looked around like he was checking if anyone was watching. And then Purbright's attention sharpened. What then? Then he pulled something out from under his jacket. A package wrapped in brown paper. He looked at it for a second like he was making sure it was safe, and then stuffed it into the inside of his coat. Fletch hesitated, then added, "It was small, but it looked heavy, like something important." The inspector's mind raced. A package, something being hidden. This was the kind of lead that could break the case wide open. He looked at Fletch carefully. "And you're sure of all this? That he was carrying something?" Fletch nodded quickly, though he still seemed unsure of himself. "Yes, sir. I know I saw it, but I wasn't sure if it mattered. Not until now." "It matters," Purbright replied, his voice firm. "Thank you for coming forward." "You've done well. Now stay here. I'll need you to give a formal statement once I've gathered all the details." With that, Purbright turned to Hodge. "We need to search the alley again. Check the surroundings. Any place the man could have hidden something." Hodge nodded, his expression serious. "Right away, sir." The inspector's eyes narrowed as he looked back out the window. The weight of the mystery was becoming heavier by the moment. There was no longer any question. Someone had been planning something in the shadows of Flaxborough, and it was Purbright's job to bring it into the light. The man who had been killed in Mrs. Driscoll's garden wasn't just a random victim. He was a part of something much larger. As Hodge prepared to head out, Purbright paused for a moment, considering his next move. The map he had found in the Black Widow house, the one marked with the X, still weighed on his mind. If the man had been carrying something important, it could be tied to whatever had been planned. But what was it? And why had it been concealed so carefully? Purbright's instincts told him that he was close, closer than he'd been in days. The past, the strange disappearance of Mrs. Driscoll's brother, the letter, the mysterious package. It was all connected. But how? As Hodge left to organize the search, Purbright stood for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around him. He could feel the tension building, the unraveling of the mystery just within reach. But there was something else now too, a sense of urgency. Whatever had been hidden, whatever had been planned, was coming to a head, and the clock was ticking. Purbright's thoughts shifted to Mrs. Driscoll. Franklin had insisted she was innocent, but there was no denying the suspicion that surrounded her. She was connected to something, whether she realized it or not. And Purbright had a feeling that the answers lay within the house itself, if he could get to her before someone else did. He turned to the door, his mind already on the next steps. It was time to confront Mrs. Driscoll, to speak to her directly, to break through the carefully constructed walls around her life. She knew more than she was letting on, and Purbright had no intention of leaving until he uncovered the truth. The silence in the station was thick, the hum of the world outside fading into the background as Purbright stood, his mind carefully piecing together the fragments of information he had gathered. The vendor's statement, the mysterious package, the map from the Black Widow house. Each new development twisted the threads tighter, forming a web that seemed to stretch into places Purbright hadn't yet dared to look. His thoughts kept circling back to Mrs. Driscoll, the key figure in all this. Franklin's insistence on her innocence was as much a shield as it was a distraction. People defended the ones they cared about, but Purbright had learned long ago not to take anything at face value. There was something hidden beneath her calm exterior, something that connected her to the death in her garden, something that no one in town had dared to acknowledge. Purbright knew it was time to confront her, to press for answers, but the longer he waited, the closer the trail grew to someone else who might be willing to speak before Mrs. Driscoll could. He wasn't the only one with questions. The sound of footsteps approaching brought him back to the present, and he turned to find Hodge entering, his expression tense but eager. In his hand he held a small piece of paper, its edges crumpled from being gripped too tightly. Purbright raised an eyebrow, noting the urgency in the constable's step. "Sir, we've found something," Hodge said, his voice low but steady. "The alley, the one the vendor mentioned. We searched around the back of the house and found this." Hodge handed Purbright the paper, which, when unfolded, revealed a set of coordinates scrawled hastily across the surface. The markings were faint, almost as if the person who had written them didn't want them to be noticed. But it was the second part of the message that caught Purbright's attention. Beneath the coordinates was a single phrase: "Meet at dusk. The plan must proceed." Purbright's eyes flicked to Hodge. "Where do these coordinates lead?" "We've just mapped them, sir," Hodge replied. "They point to the edge of the forest, just beyond the town, near the old mill. It's a dead end, no real road past it. Just trees." Purbright tucked the paper into his coat pocket without a word, his mind already racing. The coordinates, the cryptic message, it all pointed to something larger, something that had been brewing beneath the surface for far longer than anyone realized. The plan? What plan? And why had this been kept so secret? "There's more, sir," Hodge continued, his voice carrying a note of excitement. "We also found traces of something in the alley near the back door of the house. Fresh footprints. We think the man who left the house last night may have been meeting someone else who was involved." Purbright's gaze hardened, his thoughts shifting quickly. "And you're certain of this?" "We've sent the prints off for analysis," Hodge said, "but it's clear that more than one person was involved." This was the breakthrough Purbright had been waiting for, though it brought more questions than answers. The mystery of the man's death was now intertwined with something bigger, something hidden just beneath the surface of Flaxborough's quiet exterior. Someone had been orchestrating this, pulling the strings, and that someone was connected to the Black Widow house in a way that Purbright hadn't yet fully understood. Purbright stood, his mind already plotting his next move. "Hodge, I want you to prepare a team. We're going to head out to the coordinates. I need to know what's at that site before anyone else does." Hodge nodded, his face set with determination. "Understood, sir." As the constable left to gather the team, Purbright stood for a moment, his thoughts turning inward. The clock was ticking. Whoever was behind all of this was making their move, and Purbright had no intention of letting them get away with it. The missing brother, the secret past, the cryptic letters. It was all starting to come together. But one thing was clear now. Flaxborough was no longer the sleepy town it had once been. The murder in Mrs. Driscoll's garden had peeled back the layers of a much darker truth, and Purbright was about to step into it, fully aware that the answers would not be easy to uncover. He stepped outside the cold air, biting at his face as he made his way toward the waiting team. The town looked the same, but in that moment it felt entirely different. The familiar streets, the quiet corners, none of it seemed as innocent as it once had. There was a shadow now, one that stretched across Flaxborough, and it was only growing darker with each passing minute. As they reached the outskirts of town, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The coordinates led them to a dense patch of trees, and Purbright could feel the weight of the night settling in. The forest was eerily still, the only sound the crunch of dead leaves beneath their feet. "This is the place, sir," Hodge said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he surveyed the area. The old mill loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the darkening sky. Purbright nodded, scanning the area carefully. Everything about the location screamed secrecy. It was as if someone had gone out of their way to ensure that no one would find this place, hidden so far from the main roads, tucked away at the edge of the town. "We need to be cautious," Purbright muttered, his eyes narrowing as he began to move forward. The shadows seemed to deepen with each step, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. This was where the plan had been set to unfold, and Purbright was determined to be the one who stopped it before it went any further. The rustling of leaves ahead caused him to stop. Someone was here, someone waiting. He motioned for the team to spread out, moving silently through the trees. There was no time to waste. The answers and the people behind the murder were just ahead. And with each step, Purbright's resolve grew stronger. The truth was within reach, and he wasn't going to let it slip away now. The night pressed in, thick with the silence of the forest, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves as Purbright and his team moved deeper into the trees. Their steps were measured, their breaths barely audible in the cool air, and yet every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive darkness. There was something unnerving about the place. The sense that it had been untouched for years, abandoned by all, except those who wanted to keep it hidden. Purbright's eyes scanned the shadows ahead, his mind sharp, pulling together the last pieces of the puzzle. The coordinates had led them here, and now, as they reached the edge of the old mill, he felt a tension in the air like the calm before a storm. The mill was dilapidated, its once proud structure now sagging and crumbling, with ivy creeping up the walls like nature's attempt to reclaim it. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting, remote, forgotten by time, and easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. The faintest hint of light flickered from inside the building, casting long shadows across the ground. Someone was there, someone waiting. Purbright signaled for the team to fan out, their movements swift and quiet. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and damp stone as they circled the perimeter of the building. The inspector's heart rate quickened, but his face remained impassive. He had been in situations like this before, but the stakes felt different tonight. Tonight, there was more than just a murder on the line. As he crept closer to the building, Purbright's thoughts turned to Mrs. Driscoll and the cryptic message. "Meet at dusk." The plan must proceed. He didn't know what plan they were referring to, but he was certain that whatever it was tied to the murder in the garden and to the disappearance of her brother. The past had a way of coming back, and it seemed that the past of the Black Widow house was darker than anyone had realized. The sound of a footstep, soft yet distinct, caught his attention. Purbright paused, motioning for the others to stop. He listened carefully, the faint rustling of movement in the dark indicating someone was near. He could feel the tension in his chest, his instincts sharpening. The figure moved again, this time closer, a shadow in the dim light spilling from the mill. Purbright held his breath, waiting for the right moment. The figure was tall, wearing dark clothing, just like the man the vendor had described. The package, wrapped in brown paper, was nowhere to be seen, but Purbright knew better than to expect it to stay hidden for long. The figure reached the door of the mill and paused, looking around. Purbright held still, watching closely. Whoever this was, they weren't here alone. The plan was unfolding, and he was about to see it for himself. Before Purbright could make his next move, a voice cut through the silence. A familiar voice, low and calm, but carrying an edge that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Well, well. It looks like someone's come to play." The detective Purbright's pulse quickened, and he stepped back into the shadows, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. The voice belonged to none other than Franklin, the solicitor who had been so eager to defend Mrs. Driscoll. But now, here he was, standing in the shadows of the mill, a smug smile on his face as if he had been expecting this very moment. "I had a feeling you'd turn up, Inspector," Franklin continued, his voice smooth, but with an underlying tension. "But I must admit, I didn't think you'd get this far." Purbright's mind raced as he processed Franklin's words. The solicitor had been a constant presence in the investigation, always there to deflect suspicion away from Mrs. Driscoll. But now, standing in the dark with the mill looming behind him, Franklin's role in all of this was becoming painfully clear. "You've been pulling the strings all along, haven't you, Franklin?" Purbright's voice was low, his tone sharp. "You've been hiding something far worse than a simple missing person." Franklin's smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "You're out of your depth, Inspector. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Purbright stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Franklin. "I think I'm starting to figure it out. Your client, Mrs. Driscoll, isn't as innocent as you've made her out to be. And you're no simple solicitor. You're part of something much bigger, aren't you?" Franklin's expression hardened, the calm exterior cracking just enough to reveal the barely contained anger beneath. "You have no idea what you're meddling with," he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "I've tried to protect her. I've tried to protect all of us, but you—" Before he could finish, the sound of footsteps interrupted the tense moment. Another figure emerged from the shadows, a man, tall and broad-shouldered. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the area before locking on to Purbright. "Are you done, Franklin?" The man's voice was deep, gravelly, and carried the weight of authority. He had the air of someone used to giving orders. Franklin turned quickly, a flash of recognition crossing his face. "Yes, it's time." The inspector's gotten too close. Purbright's gaze flicked between the two men, the pieces finally falling into place. "I'm guessing this is your partner in crime?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension. The man chuckled darkly. "You're a sharp one, Inspector. But it's too late for you. This whole town has been in our hands for years, and you're the last piece we need to eliminate." Franklin moved toward Purbright, his hand slipping inside his coat, but Purbright was quicker. He reached for his own gun, aiming it at Franklin with practiced precision. "Stay right where you are," Purbright ordered, his voice calm but firm. "I'll ask the questions now." The man beside Franklin laughed, a low, menacing sound. "You think you can stop this? You think you can stop what's already in motion?" Purbright didn't answer immediately. He kept his focus on Franklin, watching for any sign of movement, any hesitation. The air between them crackled with tension, each of them waiting for the other to make the first move. The man in the shadows stepped forward, and Franklin followed suit. But just as Purbright was about to take control of the situation, the sound of a voice, soft but clear, cut through the standoff. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Purbright's head whipped around in the direction of the voice, and his heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Mrs. Driscoll. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, but there was something else there too, something that made Purbright freeze. The game had changed again. Purbright's hand remained steady, the barrel of his gun aimed directly at Franklin, but his mind was racing. Mrs. Driscoll, standing just beyond the shadows of the mill, was the last person he expected to see, and yet here she was, her presence throwing the entire scene into disarray. Franklin's face flickered with something that could have been surprise, or perhaps it was fear. It was difficult to tell, but the way his posture stiffened told Purbright everything he needed to know. This was the moment where things would either collapse or come together. "Mrs. Driscoll," Purbright said, his voice calm but sharp, cutting through the thick silence that had descended. He kept his eyes trained on Franklin, unwilling to let his guard down. "What's going on here?" For a long moment Mrs. Driscoll didn't move, her gaze fixed on the scene before her. She was trembling slightly, but there was a quiet resolve in her eyes that made Purbright pause. This was the woman whose life had seemed so simple, so sheltered in her reclusive little house. Now, standing in the clearing, she was part of something much bigger, something dark and dangerous. "I never wanted this," Mrs. Driscoll finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried enough weight to make the men fall silent. She stepped forward, the dim light from the mill casting long shadows across her face. "I thought it was all behind me. But Franklin's right. It's too late to stop it now." Franklin shifted uncomfortably at her words, but he didn't speak. Instead, he watched the exchange between Purbright and Mrs. Driscoll, his eyes wary, like a man waiting for the inevitable collapse of something he'd spent too long trying to protect. Purbright's gaze never wavered from Mrs. Driscoll. "What are you involved in, Mrs. Driscoll? I need you to tell me everything. This isn't just about the murder anymore, is it?" She hesitated, her hands wringing the hem of her coat, as if gathering the strength to speak. Her eyes shifted toward the darkened mill, as if looking for reassurance from its crumbling walls. The moment stretched out, each second growing heavier. "No," she said finally, her voice hardening. "It's not just about the murder." Her eyes flicked to Franklin, and then back to Purbright. "It's about everything. About what my brother, what he started." Purbright's heart skipped. The missing brother, the key to everything. He had known that there was something crucial in the past that tied all of this together, but hearing Mrs. Driscoll say it so plainly brought a clarity that had eluded him until now. "Your brother?" Purbright asked, his voice quiet but filled with purpose. "What did he start? What happened to him?" Mrs. Driscoll looked down, her hands trembling, as she clasped them tightly together. He was part of something dangerous. He got involved with people he shouldn't have, people who don't leave witnesses." Purbright's mind raced. "So, he disappeared because of them? Because he knew too much?" "Yes," Mrs. Driscoll whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I tried to forget it all. I thought if I kept to myself, if I hid long enough, it would go away." She took a shaky breath, her eyes filled with tears. "But it didn't. And now, because of me, because of what I've kept hidden, people are dying." Franklin shifted again, stepping closer to Mrs. Driscoll, his expression one of both sympathy and urgency. "Enough, Margaret. You don't need to tell him everything. It's over now." Purbright's eyes narrowed at Franklin's intervention, sensing that there was more he wasn't saying. He turned his attention back to Mrs. Driscoll. "You're saying that your brother was involved in something that led to all of this. But what exactly are you hiding? What's been going on in this town that no one's talked about?" For a long moment, she didn't respond. Her eyes flicked from Purbright to Franklin, as though weighing the consequences of what would happen next. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling, but growing stronger with each word. "There's a group," she said. "A secret group. My brother found them by accident, but he got caught up in it. He thought he could use the information to make money, but he couldn't get out, and they knew he'd gone to the authorities. So they took him, and they made sure no one would ever find him." Purbright took a step closer, his mind reeling from the implications. "And Franklin, what does he have to do with this?" Mrs. Driscoll looked at Franklin, her eyes filled with regret. "He's been protecting me," she said softly, her gaze falling. "I've been hiding from them for years, and Franklin has..." He's kept things quiet, made sure nothing came to light. But it's all unraveling now. The group, he's a part of it. Franklin stiffened, his face reddening. "That's enough, Margaret," he snapped, his voice suddenly cold and threatening. "You don't know what you're saying. You don't understand the danger." Purbright raised his gun a fraction of an inch, his eyes hard. "I think she understands perfectly well, Mr. Franklin. The truth is coming out now and you can't stop it." The tension in the clearing thickened. Franklin's gaze flickered between Purbright and Mrs. Driscoll, the weight of his situation pressing down on him. Purbright could see the panic growing behind his calm exterior, the fear that had been lurking all along, the realization that the walls were closing in. "Margaret," Franklin began, his voice strained, "you don't need to do this. We can still protect you. We can still fix this." But Mrs. Driscoll shook her head, her face set with a grim determination. "No, Franklin. It's too late for that." Purbright took another step forward, his mind now completely focused on the truth that was beginning to unfold. "What group are you talking about, Mrs. Driscoll? Who are they?" Mrs. Driscoll's eyes were filled with fear, but there was no turning back now. "They're the ones who've been controlling everything in this town. They've been pulling the strings for years, keeping things quiet, making sure no one knew the truth. But now it's all falling apart. And if we don't stop it, if you don't stop them, there will be more deaths. More people will die." Purbright's heart pounded in his chest as he took in her words. The shadowy group that had been pulling the strings in Flaxborough for years, the ones who had orchestrated the murder in the garden. And now they were planning something even darker. Purbright turned to Hodge, who had been standing at the ready just behind him. "We need to move fast," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I don't care who they are or how long they've been here. We're going to stop this, now." But as Purbright looked back to the clearing, he saw the faint flicker of movement in the distance, more figures emerging from the shadows. The night was far from over. Purbright's instincts kicked in immediately. These figures emerging from the shadows weren't just distant shapes, they were people, purposeful in their movements, intent on something. Purbright could feel the shift in the air as the clearing, once still, now seemed to hold its breath. Franklin's face was a mask of frustration, his eyes darting between Purbright and the emerging group. He knew what was coming, and he wasn't ready for it. "Margaret!" Franklin's voice was tight with panic. "We need to leave." Now, but Mrs. Driscoll didn't move. She stood tall as if she had already made her decision. "No, Franklin. I've already done too much running." Purbright's eyes tracked the figures now advancing from the darkness. They moved with precision like soldiers on a mission. Their faces were obscured by the shadows, but the danger was palpable. They weren't here to talk, they were here to finish what had been started. The atmosphere was electric with the weight of unspoken threats. Purbright didn't flinch. He kept his focus on the group, his gun still aimed at Franklin, but his mind was already calculating, ready for whatever move came next. "You've made a mistake, Inspector," a voice called out from the shadows. It was low, controlled, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. The man who stepped forward was tall, his movements deliberate and smooth. His face was calm, almost serene, but there was something chilling in the way he looked at Purbright. "We've been waiting for this moment, you know," the man continued, his tone almost mocking. "For someone like you to finally start asking the right questions. But you're too late. This goes far deeper than you could ever understand." Purbright's gaze didn't waver. He didn't recognize the man, but the presence was undeniable. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady, every word deliberate. The man smiled, but it was a thin, humorless smile. "I'm someone who's been watching just like you, Inspector." watching as the pieces move, as the game plays out. And now, it's time for the final act. Purbright's grip on his gun tightened. The pieces were coming together, and yet the bigger picture still eluded him. What game were they playing? Who had they been manipulating all along? "You're part of this group?" Purbright asked, his voice growing harder, more focused. "The one that's been controlling everything in Flaxborough?" The man's smile faded slightly. "You've been poking around in the right places, but not enough. You see, Flaxborough isn't as peaceful as it seems. It's always been under the thumb of those who know how to pull the strings." The words hung in the air, thick with menace. It was clear now, the group was real. They had been operating in the shadows for far too long, pulling the strings, orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. And now they were here to silence anyone who threatened their control. Purbright's mind raced as he pieced it together. "Your group," he said slowly. "You've been behind the murder of the man in the garden, and you've been hiding the truth about Mrs. Driscoll's brother. The man didn't deny it." He simply nodded, as though Purbright had finally understood the game they were playing. "It's always been about power, Inspector. Control. We've made sure that no one here questions what goes on behind closed doors. And we've kept it that way for years." Purbright's mind turned over the possibilities. The murder, the disappearance of Driscoll's brother, the strange occurrences in the town, everything had been orchestrated to keep people in the dark, to maintain their hold on power. But why? What were they planning? And how far would they go to keep their secrets hidden? Suddenly, a noise broke through the tension, the rustling of leaves behind him. Purbright's reflexes kicked in. He spun, his gun aimed at the source of the sound, but it was only Hodge and a few of the team, moving swiftly and silently through the trees. They had followed the inspector's lead, and now they were in position. The man from the group didn't seem fazed by their arrival. In fact, he seemed almost pleased. "I see you've brought backup," he said, his eyes glinting with cold amusement. "But it won't matter. You're too late. The plan is already in motion." "What plan?" Purbright demanded. "What is it you're trying to do?" The man's smile returned, this time tinged with satisfaction. "It's a bit more complicated than you think, Inspector. You see, Mrs. Driscoll's brother didn't just vanish. He was part of something far bigger, a movement, if you will. And now we're ready to make our move. But first, we needed to clean up the mess." He glanced at Franklin, whose face was twisted with something between guilt and anger. "You killed him," Purbright said, piecing it together. "The man in the garden. You needed to get rid of him because he knew too much." The man's eyes darkened. "Yes, he knew too much. He was too close to unraveling what we've been building here. But now it's all going according to plan, and you're too late to stop it." Purbright's grip tightened on his gun. "You're not going to get away with this." "We already have," the man replied with a quiet laugh. "You've played your part. You've brought yourself to the edge of the truth, but it's not enough. There's nothing you can do now. The wheels are already in motion. Flaxborough will never be the same again." As the last words left his lips, the man signaled to his group, and they began to move in closer, surrounding Purbright and his team. The inspector's mind raced. This wasn't just about the murder anymore. It was about something far larger, a plan that had been set into motion long before he'd ever stepped foot in this town. "Move in," Purbright said to Hodge, his voice sharp. "We're not backing down now." The team moved swiftly, taking their positions, but Purbright knew that the fight ahead was going to be much more than just a confrontation in the woods. This was the culmination of everything that had been set in motion, the moment where the truth would finally come to light, or where it would be buried for good. The air was thick with tension as the two sides faced off, each knowing that this would be the moment that decided everything. The truth was so close now, and Purbright was ready to see it through to the end. Purbright's mind raced as the group closed in, the tension thick enough to cut through. Franklin stood beside the man, his posture rigid, but his eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. The rest of the group, shrouded in darkness, shifted, like shadows brought to life by some unseen force. They weren't just here to intimidate, they were here to finish what they had started. The plan, whatever it was already in motion. Purbright took a measured breath, his mind working quickly. The pieces were falling into place, but the full picture was still elusive. The man in front of him, cool, composed, but clearly confident in his superiority, was part of something much larger, something dark. Purbright had heard whispers about power struggles, about hidden control, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. "You said the plan is already in motion," Purbright spoke slowly, his voice calm but heavy with determination. "What exactly is it you're trying to do? What have you been building here?" The man smiled, a cold, detached smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're so close, Inspector. But you still don't understand? What we're doing, it's not just about control, it's about changing the entire system. This town, this little corner of the world, it's just the beginning. But you've already figured out too much. It's time to end it." The words hit Purbright like a sudden blow. The weight of them sank deep. They weren't just after some petty power. They were trying to reshape something fundamental, something that could have implications far beyond Flaxborough. His eyes flicked to Mrs. Driscoll, who was still standing, her face pale but steady. She was trapped, caught in the web her brother had left behind, and now, it seemed, the web was about to consume her. "We've been waiting for someone like you, Purbright," the man continued, his voice lowering. "Someone who wouldn't be content with the surface story. Someone who would dig. But you see, that's the problem, isn't it? Once you start digging, you don't just uncover the truth, you expose everything, and that's dangerous for all of us." Purbright's grip tightened around his gun, but he didn't move. The man was baiting him, trying to provoke a reaction. He had no intention of giving him the satisfaction. "I don't care what you think you're protecting," Purbright replied, his voice cold now. "If you think I'm going to let you destroy this town, you're mistaken." The man's smile faltered for a brief moment, just enough for Purbright to notice, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He gestured to Franklin, who still hadn't said a word, his expression unreadable. "It's too late for heroics," the man said. "You've already walked into our trap. And now all that's left is to clean up." Purbright wasn't sure what they meant by clean up, but he had an unsettling feeling that he was about to find out. His mind raced, searching for any last clue that could turn the tide in their favor. But it was becoming clear this wasn't just about the murder. This was about a larger, more dangerous game, and he was standing at the edge of it. Just then a rustling came from the trees behind him, a faint whisper of movement. Purbright's instincts kicked in again. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the figures in front of him. There was something happening in the periphery, something he couldn't see but could feel, the hairs on his neck standing up. His eyes flicked toward Hodge, who was trying to get into position without being noticed. But there was no time for subtlety now. He had to act. "Move!" Purbright shouted suddenly, his voice breaking the tension in the air. "Get into position!" The team reacted instantly, moving with practiced efficiency. Hodge and the others shifted into position, their weapons drawn, ready to take action. The man in front of Purbright stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he realized the moment had come. Franklin's face showed a flicker of something, fear, guilt, it was hard to tell. Purbright didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, keeping his eyes locked on the man in front of him. The group around him started to react, but they weren't quick enough. He could sense that they were losing control of the situation, and Purbright wasn't about to let them regain it. In one swift motion, he took a step to the side, aiming his gun squarely at the leader. "You don't get to play God with this town," he said, coldly. The man's eyes flickered with a moment of surprise before his smile returned, though it was now tinged with something darker. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice low and threatening. "But you will soon enough." Purbright didn't answer. Instead, he nodded sharply at Hodge. The team moved in, tightening the circle. The man's words were nothing more than noise now. They had reached the tipping point, and there was no turning back. "Move her," Purbright commanded, his voice calm but firm. Hodge, his face grim, nodded and moved to Mrs. Driscoll's side. She looked up at him, and for the first time there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition perhaps, or the relief that she had been freed from the weight of her silence. But before anything could unfold further, the sudden jarring sound of a gunshot rang out, sharp and close. The crack of the bullet filled the air, and everything seemed to slow for a split second, like time itself had paused in disbelief. Purbright turned instinctively, his eyes locking onto Franklin. But it wasn't Franklin who had fired. The shot had come from one of the group members, someone hidden in the shadows, taking a final desperate shot. Purbright ducked instinctively, pulling Mrs. Driscoll to the ground as the team scattered into position. The shot had missed him, but it had grazed the side of a nearby tree, sending splinters flying in every direction. The clearing erupted in chaos as the group mobilized, each side scrambling for control. For a brief moment everything was chaos, shouts, movement, the sudden clash of wills as the team engaged. Purbright's heart raced, but he kept his focus sharp. The moment had arrived. This was it. No more waiting, no more games. He moved quickly, pulling Mrs. Driscoll behind a tree for cover, his eyes scanning for threats, his mind already racing ahead. He couldn't afford to lose ground now. The stakes were higher than ever. But as the sound of gunfire rang out again, Purbright realized just how deep the web went. Every movement, every decision had led to this, and now there was no turning back.